Hello and welcome to Inclusion Dialogue, a podcast where we discuss everything related to inclusive education and diversity in the classroom. My name is Joanne Banks and I'm a lecturer in Trinity College Dublin in the School of Education. This podcast consists of interviews between me and leading academics from all over the world where we discuss how we define inclusive and special education. We look at the difference between theory and practice and what inclusion looks like on the ground in our schools. I began this project for my students, and it was to allow them to hear the views of researchers that I was getting them to read in the form of journal articles and research reports. I've been pretty overwhelmed by the response though, and I think as the podcast has grown, it will be of a much broader appeal to other academics, to policymakers, to educators and practitioners, to parents, but also to students themselves. My guest this week is Professor Richard Rose, Professor Emeritus in Inclusive Education at the University of Northampton in the UK. Many of my Irish listeners will know Richard from his work as PI with Professor Michael Shevlin on Project Iris. His work goes far beyond Ireland though, and he has worked for more than 20 years in India on research projects there. In this podcast, we discuss how we need to exercise caution in how models of inclusion are transferred across different cultures. Thanks, Richard, for agreeing to this podcast today. I really appreciate you giving up your time. I have been following your work for many, many years. I've known you for many, many years as well. So it's really great to chat in person and really to kind of explore the key topics around inclusive education, which you are an expert in. So can I start by asking just maybe something a little bit about your career path? So how did you end up working in this field?
Okay, I qualified as a teacher originally back in the 1970s, and I'd always had a particular interest in children who'd been marginalised, or, well, not just children, people who had been deprived of their rights. I mean, as a student, I was very involved in things like the anti-apartheid movement, for instance. So I suppose some political background as well. My first teaching job was actually in a mining community, a relatively poor community in Western terms, in South Derbyshire. And it soon became apparent to me that many of the children I was teaching were perhaps limited in their life chances because there was very low expectation about what these children might achieve. There was a certain amount of class discrimination, I suppose you'd call it. And there was very little history of children from that community progressing to education beyond the statutory school leaving age. I was aware that there were children who I was teaching who were very clever and could easily have gone on to university, for instance, and done very well. This was primary level I was teaching, I should have said. But I was also aware that there were children who were really struggling, who came from homes where maybe literacy levels were low and very little engagement with formal education. And it seemed to me when I was teaching then that this kind of struggle these children were going through needed somebody to look a little bit more, with a little bit more of an open mind as to what they could achieve, maybe. And although I'd had a background from my school days, actually, of working voluntarily in special schools, for instance, this was something which really, I think, increased my awareness of how the education system was perhaps failing a significant number of children, and really wanted to make some kind of contribution to changing that.
And I presume you're talking about a time when these children wouldn't have been, the label of special education or disability wouldn't have been attached to them. It was simply they were underachieving relative to the rest of the group, right?
Yeah, this was a day when we still had expressions. We still had remedial teachers, for instance. And this expression, backward children, I never did understand that term. What does it mean to be backward? It's so there was a lot of, I suppose, negative language which came from a frustration of not knowing how to teach children. I think it's quite easy to condemn the language of the day, but I think people were really struggling to come up with a reason why these children weren't weren't learning. And we still do use language a lot, I think, to justify our own failure as professionals, as teachers, as academics, for instance. If we can kind of push that blame for failure onto a label, you can't expect this child to learn because he's got Down syndrome, or, all the children from that housing estate struggle with learning. So, just do your best and don't expect much. And I think I found in my early teaching days that there was a lot of that, that I think I was very sensitive, myself being the first person from my family ever to benefit from higher education, and coming from a very working class background myself. I think I became, in my early years of teaching, even more aware of why, when I was at school, the children who came from the local council estate, social housing, etc., were failing in school because teachers just looked to them and thought, well, they're not going to achieve much. Look at their background, which of course is complete nonsense.
Yeah.
But, and at the time, I started to realise that.
And do you think that I like your comment on the language, and I suppose what you're kind of getting at there is that whole kind of medicalization or the deficit model, as in the deficit lying within the child rather than anything else. Do you think we still have that? Do you think we still adopt that in classrooms?
Yes, I think we do. I think there's still a kind of medical deficit approach in many ways. The labelling thing is interesting because it has positives as well as negatives, actually. And, through the work I've done in Ireland, for instance, with Michael Shevlin and Project Iris, if you have a label, it attracts resources. So there are many parents who are quite happy to have a label for their child. My child has ADHD, and therefore, with that label comes additional support in the classroom. Those kind of, I don't think that's a positive thing, incidentally. I think, those resources should be available simply because of the child's learning need, not because they've got a label. But yes, I mean, the labelling is still an issue. I still visit schools today where teachers will say, we can manage children with special needs in our class, but the children with autism are particularly challenging. As if there is this kind of blanket term, autism, which can be applied as if everybody with that label is the same. It's just like any other label. It's just like, the label woman,
Yeah.
If I say, you're just a typical woman, what does that mean? It's nonsense. It denies the personality, the integrity of the individual that we're actually dealing with. Yeah. So it is still a problem.
I think so. Yeah, I would agree with you. And, going back to kind of your link between, say, the council estate where you taught and maybe kind of literacy issues, can you talk a little bit about work that you've done with that intersection between disadvantage and disability? What are your findings around that over the years?
Yeah, I think I find it hard these days to disassociate my interpretation of that from maybe some of the work I've done outside of European contexts, mainly in Asian contexts. It's apparent to me that behind an awful lot of the learning difficulties and the deprivation that we see is poverty. There's no doubt about that. And now poverty, if you like, is a term which is differently interpreted in different contexts. I'm fortunate. I've seen poverty in Africa and in Asia far more significant than I've ever seen, certainly in my own country and throughout most of Europe. But I think there is a clear correlation between poverty and difficulties with learning and difficulties in gaining access to learning. With poverty, people who live in poverty are more likely to have a child with a disability. That's an indisputable fact. If you live in poverty, you're less likely to have access to good health and welfare facilities. You're likely to have a lesser diet. Your nutrition is going to be lower than it is for those who are living in more affluent or comfortable surroundings. You're less likely to have access to the kind of knowledge that those of us who live in kind of privileged middle class backgrounds have. So you probably struggle to get access to the systems that you need. If your own education has been limited through poverty, you may not be articulate enough to deal with some of the complexities of gaining the support you need. And you may even be intimidated by these people who have titles, physiotherapist, pediatrician, psychologist, who you see as having, and they do have undoubtedly, a kind of code of their own and an education which is beyond yours. So if you live in poverty, you're more likely to have a child with a disability. Also, if you have a child with a disability, you're more likely to fall into poverty. There's a clear relationship here. It costs far more to bring up a child with a disability than it does to bring up any other child. You'd probably need more resources. You probably are looking after this child through a period of infancy, which lasts much longer than most children. We regularly see children who are 10, 11, 12 years old who are still, for instance, incontinent and requiring the kind of support that you would give to an infant. And that means often that usually women who are themselves discriminated against in this process, I feel, women often have to give up work to look after their child. Life is a struggle and they end up in poverty. It's a vicious circle. So I don't think we should ever think that our role as educators, or, I know my background is very much in education, but we should not divorce that from our responsibilities to look at the kind of social and economic issues that surround inclusion as well. Yeah. Because if we do so, we're just going to get nowhere. Inclusion isn't an educational issue.
Yeah, it's a societal.
Education is one part of the solution.
Now, you've mentioned a couple of times, like you've obviously done a huge amount of research in Ireland with Michael, as you mentioned, and in the UK. But you've also, a large area of your research is in Asian countries, and you mentioned Africa as well. Can you talk a little bit about maybe cultural differences in how we interpret inclusive education, or just maybe take the broader inclusion idea between different societies like that?
Yes, I think this is a really important issue. If we look, if I put my academic hat on and I look at the research and the writing around inclusion, a number of things are very apparent. And, for example, I've worked with master's students and PhD students in India a lot, over 100 master's students in India, and I currently have 7 Indian PhD students.
Right.
One of the things they say to me regularly is, we're dependent upon the literature of the West. There's very little literature from India. I mean, I often say to them, well, it's your responsibility to generate that literature. That's part of what we're here for. And some of them have been successful in doing that. So I think one of the things that bothers me a lot is that when we talk about inclusion, or when many people talk about inclusion, they talk about a Western model of inclusion. There's a wealth of literature from, as we know, from Europe, from North America, from Australia and New Zealand, which I know are not strictly speaking Western countries, but Westernized approaches to education and society, if you like. And unfortunately, this is being held up as a model for where everybody should go. Now, that kind of top-down approach to inclusion, I think, is very, very dangerous, because what it's done in some communities, some of the communities, for instance, I've worked in India and recently in Cambodia, young people, young teachers have looked at those models of inclusion. They've looked at what's happening in the West and feel that they need to go immediately to that model. They don't have the resources to do it. They do not have the commitment from local communities to move that quickly. And I think sometimes we forget our own history here. Many of the teachers who were at the forefront of developing inclusive education themselves came from a special education background with many years' experience. I mean, if I take a good friend and colleague of mine, Mel Ainscough, who will be known to you and maybe even one of your podcasters. I first met Mel when he was head of a special school in the West Midlands of the UK. And he honed his skills and understanding of how to teach children who were labelled as having special educational needs through that approach.
Yeah.
Now, quite rightly, we've moved on in our thinking here in the West. We say, these children who were previously taught in special schools ought to be in mainstream schools.
Yeah.
But if I translate that to some of the systems I've seen in India and recently in Cambodia, or what I saw, for instance, in Sierra Leone, people are trying to go from a situation where children are completely out of education, not in school at all, to the inclusion model we have now.
Okay.
Now that's skipping that middle section, if you like, of no education to special school to mainstream school. I don't think that's a bad thing if it's properly resourced and teachers are properly supported to do it. But when I look at what's happening in Ireland, for instance, now, and the work I did with Michael, teacher training has changed significantly in Ireland. Now, I know within Ireland, people are still critical of teacher training in terms of the understanding people are given of pedagogy that supports inclusion and that it's tokenistic in some way. But it's there. It's moved forward. And I've seen really good examples. I've seen good examples up in Sligo, for instance, of what they're doing up there at St Angela's, for instance. I've seen really good examples at Trinity in Dublin of trying to enable teachers to have a much more inclusive mindset and to have the skills, knowledge, understanding to be able to go in and change schools.
Yeah.
But that's a critical factor, and it's not necessarily there in other countries. So I am very concerned that I go to some of these countries, and India's been a prime example of this for me, because I've worked in India for more than 20 years, and I've been going 3 or 4 times a year until this pandemic struck. And I've seen teachers who said to me, we want to build an inclusive school. Our school is going to be an inclusive school. And they talk to me about the kind of models we have in the West. And then I look at their situation and the poorly trained teachers, the lack of resources, particularly in the rural environments. And I think we're doing a disservice if we just simply say, we have developed an approach in the West that is the right approach. It may be right for us, and I'm not always convinced it is, but it's not something which you could just pick up and put down somewhere else. There is a certain amount of what I would call educational imperialism in the world, where we've developed systems here and we've tried to export them. And people need to spend time understanding the cultural situations in the country to affect change.
I think that's really interesting. And back in the day, I did research on the Irish, the beginnings of the Irish education system back in the 1830s, the national school system. And I believe there was books from the Irish education system being given to children in New Zealand, being used at the time. So it's obviously nothing new is what you're talking about, but I'm interested to hear that it's possibly kind of negligent or a dangerous situation where people are, would you say, skipping a step, or the infrastructure is not there, or the kind of supports aren't there?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of those things. Like I said, I don't mind the skipping a step if it's properly managed. I'm not advocating that we suddenly open a lot of special schools in these countries. On the other hand, I would rather see a child go to a special school that was meeting their needs effectively than not going to school at all. And I'm certainly not going to condemn people who work in special schools, because they're often the most committed professionals I meet in my own country and internationally. But I think, that there is a real danger. And this is going to sound highly critical of some of my colleagues, but I think those people who want to talk about inclusion, and there's an awful lot of talk about inclusion, they need to get out and do it. They need to be working with people in communities, sharing their experience and their ideas and learning from them and working with them in partnership. I mean, I can give an example. I was recently in Cambodia, and I was in a province called Kampong Cham, very rural community where I ran focus groups with colleagues from an organisation called Caritas, and we ran focus groups with parents and their children with disabilities. They have no school, they have no health centre, they have very poor social interaction with anybody outside of their villages. They're completely isolated with their children. Now, they know that their children, according to Cambodian law, have a right to go to school. But simply having a policy that says they have a right to go to school doesn't mean to say that they do go to school. I went to the local school in the villages there, the local schools, and spoke to the school principals and teachers. They're not unwilling to discuss the idea of having a child with cerebral palsy, for instance, in the school, but they're terrified of the idea.
Yeah.
Because the schools are not properly equipped, they're not accessible, the staff have had no training, they're struggling with the class sizes they've got now. To be quite honest, some of the teachers are not very well qualified anyway. So for me, the most important thing of meeting with those parents was listening to what they want. They don't just want their children to go to school. They want to be listened to and to have the kind of education that is appropriate to their community and their situation. And they're full of innovation. They're full of ideas. What they don't have are resources at the moment. So for somebody to go in from outside and say, oh, what you need is this and what you need is that, I think is completely inappropriate. I think we need to find out from them what they think they need and work with them to help them to get the kind of education they need for their children. And that may not be a school in the form that we know it.
Yeah.
It may be something completely different. It may require, for instance, training volunteers to do some of the work with these children. It's inappropriate that we think that we've got the solutions here in the West and move them on. And I said, I'm critical of some of my colleagues. I don't want to read any more about teacher attitudes towards inclusion. These days, when students approach me or potential students, they say, I'd like to do my PhD. I said, what would you like to do it on? I'd like to do it on teacher attitudes to inclusion. I said, so, well, what are you going to do this different from the other 500 papers that have been written about this?
About that one area, yeah.
Yeah. Why not think about doing something practical? And, one of the best pieces of work I've had from a student, an MA student actually, in recent years, was a young woman living in a poor community in India who did a single child case study of a girl who'd been denied access to school. She took her into the school where she was working and designed programs to enable her to learn academically and socially. It was a one child. It's not generalizable. Our colleagues would say, well, what use is that? But actually, we need more of that kind of work, really, to show what can be done. And that means getting down with people and actually working with them rather than just coming up. We all know about the theories. I've seen Marxist analysis of education. I've seen Foucauldian analysis of inclusion. And I'm not saying we don't need that. Yeah. But it's not all we need. And the people who are doing that are doing us a service in terms of making us think. But we need to move a long way beyond that thinking and listening to other people.
Can I finish with a very selfish Irish perspective? And I just would love your views on it. As you know, Ireland's kind of at a bit of a crossroads in terms of its own inclusion debate. And, I suppose listening to you there talking about policy borrowing or planting, like in many ways, we've had some international voices come into Ireland over the past couple of years and show us, different models of a full, inclusion model. But as you also know, we operate systems of special classes and special schools. If I was to put you in charge of the reins there, what would you say would be a good best steps for us to take next?
I think from my perspective, it was a great privilege for me to work on Project Iris, and I've been working on and off in Ireland, working with Michael Shevlin, for instance, since 2003, when we worked on the Encouraging Voices project together. I think the first thing I would say is you've got to look at the positives. Ireland impresses me immensely on a number of levels. The first level actually is a kind of administrative and organisational level. I would praise the NCSE to the hilt. I don't think they always get it right. And sometimes I read things around the NCSE and I would question some of it. But actually, as an organisation, they've made an immense commitment to supporting teachers, to funding research. And one of the things that I really like about NCSE is they're interested in an evidence-based approach to change. So when I look at documents they produced, like the work they did on individual education plans, which now I will say when I read, I feel is a bit dated, to be quite honest. But what they did in that document was they took the evidence that had been gathered from some of their studies and shaped their work on the basis of that. It wasn't just we need a policy, so let's develop something and shove it out to schools. So I'm impressed on that level. The other thing that I find interesting in Ireland, and we mustn't stereotype in any way, but there's a certain rebellious nature I find in schools in Ireland. I do find people are prepared to stand up and say no, much more so than they are in the UK. I mean, in the UK, teachers have been cowed by the education system, by successive education ministers of all political complexions, and have just been compliant and gone along. Whereas I find teachers in Ireland are far more argumentative and prepared to actually challenge things. And I think that's a positive thing. In terms of the schools in Ireland, I think, I've been very privileged. I was trying to work out a couple of years ago how many schools I visited in Ireland. It's over 100 over the years, either through research projects or through my role as an examiner for various courses, and also in every county in Ireland, which is nice.
Not a lot of people can say that.
And that's been an immense privilege. I would say one of the things that strikes me about Ireland is very similar to what I've seen actually in other countries, less so in the UK, but and that is a kind of an urban-rural divide. I do feel that some of the children who have difficulties and families who are struggling to get support, who live in rural areas, find it much harder than those in the cities. And I think, the thing which always, through Project Iris and colleagues like Michael and Jennifer Doran at NCSE, for instance, knew my feelings about this. The fact that in order to gain resources, you've got to have a label in Ireland. And that NEPS, I should say the National Education Psychological Service, Education Psychology Service, we're all powerful in so much as you had to have a NEPS assessment and psychological assessment in order to gain access. And it was quite clear from the research we did on Project Iris that if you lived in Dublin or you lived in Cork or even lived in Galway, it was far easier to obtain that than it was in, I don't know, certainly than it was in Letterkenny, for instance, or somewhere else in a rural area, parts of County Mayo, for instance. Far, far easier. And there is still that, I think, barrier to gaining the support you need, which is, again, partly economic. Because, parents actually said to us, if I've got to travel into Dublin to get an assessment, it costs me money, both in terms of the travel and things people don't recognise, like childminding and those kind of factors as well, or taking time off work in order to do that. So I think there is an issue there. But in general, I think in Ireland, and I think there's an advantage Ireland has in being a relatively small country. There is a commitment to equity. It seems to me that the people I've worked with in Ireland at all levels, from policy making down to people, families and working at the grassroots, there is a recognition of the rights of children and the requirement to improve the lives of some children.
Yeah.
And I also think Ireland's often been willing to face up to the fact that they've got things wrong sometimes. So I've heard from people saying, well, we used to think this and, now we've moved on and we have to learn from that. So I'm quite optimistic about Ireland. And, I'm looking forward to getting back there because I always feel I'm learning from the people I work with in Ireland.
Yeah.
And that's a really good thing for us. And at the moment, I have to say, and this is completely off the subject really, but I listen to our current Prime Minister and think that his understanding of the Irish situation is so absolutely limited that it frightens me that I might not be welcome in Ireland if he has his way.
I think a lot of people listen to him with the same level of frustration here. But
that's fine.
Richard, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like to mention before I let you go?
I think the only last thing I would say about my own work and particularly my work with Michael is I think listening is an important part of this process. As you know, Michael and I have worked a lot on understanding the voices of children and their families, and from the Encouraging Voices project to more recent work we've done and work we're doing together at the moment. But I think a lot of people pay lip service to those voices. They listen to them, they use them for their own research, maybe in their own purposes. But we should be listening to those voices to learn about the kind of actions that we should be taking on people's behalf, rather than just exploiting those voices for our own kind of aggrandizement, if you like, as academics. And I know, the Growing Up in Ireland project was a good example where you did listen to voices and you did try to shape policy on the basis of that. So, and again, that's something. Growing Up in Ireland could never happen in England.
Do you not think so?
No.
Can I ask you why?
I think it would be blocked at every level politically.
Do you think so?
Yeah, I think so. Because people would be frightened it wouldn't give the answers that they wanted.
Yeah, and I think it has given answers here that people didn't want, but my God, what a resource. It's endless resource. At whatever angle.
That's something I said earlier. People are willing to debate that.
Yeah.
And, I've used some of the Growing Up in Ireland materials in Ireland when I've been teaching in Ireland, as well as using it as examples elsewhere in the world. Not everybody agrees with all the findings, but everybody does appreciate that the study's been done.
Yeah.
And I think that's, a tribute to the way the Irish system has developed. You should be very proud of the work you've done there.
Great. Well, listen, Richard, thank you so much for that. I really, really enjoyed it. And I think it'll be a real contribution. So thanks again. Cheers.
Thank you.
I hope you took something from that interview. So thank you for listening. Feel free to spread the word and share the episode. You can find out more from my academic website, bankoninclusion.com, and I will catch you next time.